Welcome, my name is Russell. I'm an interpreter here in the Powhatan town site at Jamestown Settlement. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about arrow building, making an arrow, essentially from start to finish. We've headed out here and we've got a good suitable candidate for arrow wood. Traditionally you're going to see several different plants utilized in the eastern woodlands to make arrows. River cane is a fairly dominant one in the southeast, but not all arrows are necessarily well made from river cane. So you'll see many types of woods, hardwoods and a little bit lighter woods. So saplings and branches of hickory and oak can be utilized. As far as walnut and poplar sometimes being used. A very common one though is actually arrowwood viburnum, which is where it procures that name originally. What we have here is a bit of a stand-in. This is an invasive plant known as privet, which grows fairly similar in pattern to arrowwood viburnum and is prevalent in the eastern woodlands nowadays and has a lot of the similar characteristics as far as actual use in wood. So we're going to go ahead and harvest a shaft from this privet plant here. Traditionally you've got probably a whole slew of different ways that these shafts can be harvested. Simple stone flake blades like this that we'll be using more later can actually be used to saw at the base. So I'll use this to help remove something that's in the way the shaft I want. You can see it saws through the green wood without a huge amount of effort. You can see more formalized stone knives used for the same idea. However, oftentimes the blades on these are a little important enough so that you're not going to use them up on something as simple as this. And then a very simple one, especially for harvesting more sizable arrow shafts when you have the space, would be simply a stone hatchet like this, which is actually a ground stone tool. So I'm going to go ahead and use this to go ahead and clear a space and then harvest this one arrow shaft. Alright, now that we've harvested the shaft, we'll go ahead and head on over and prep it to be turned into an arrow. We've gone out and we've harvested the wood shaft for the arrow. As mentioned before, some of them would actually be river cane, which I have some examples of here, a reed similar to bamboo. But we've harvested this privet shaft, which would be fairly similar to, as I mentioned, arrowwood viburnum. And what we're going to do now is go ahead and while the wood is soft and green, take this little flint blade here and actually cut a notch for where the string of the bow will fit into the arrow when it's well and finished. So now that the shaft has a early notch cut in it, you kind of have two options. Now the shaft can be worked green as is and turned into an arrow, but it will have a lot of moisture that will have to be addressed, either cooked out or allowed to dry, protected, maybe with some fats or oils to keep the wood from drying too fast and cracking apart. Probably the more common method you're going to see actually though would be to take the arrow shaft much like it is now and go ahead and bundle it tight, like I have this bundle here with several other shafts that you've cut. That way they can dry over time without as much risk of cracking, and bundling them tight to each other keeps them straight during the process, or at least relatively straight. So we've gone ahead and we've bundled the shafts, put them away, and they've dried for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, depending on the environment that you have them in. And now, with our cane and wood shafts, we might need to thin them a little bit to make them the right thickness for us to use on our bow. So I can take this little flint blade that we used earlier to notch it. I can actually go ahead and use that to whittle and work out some of the knots from the arrow shaft. You can see just little shaving sort of coming off. Different edges on the blade will produce different results as far as how much wood you're actually trying to remove. And even though the river cane can commonly be cut right at the diameter that you want, it's usually important to go ahead and remove some of the little rough edges are right around the knots of the cane so that it flies smoothly over your hand as you shoot it, but also smoothly into your target and through the air as well. Now that we have two shafts which have been notched and are pretty well thinned or shaped to what we want them to be, we're going to go ahead and use a combination of heat and moisture to bend them straight. We have the shaft, which has been straightened, it's been notched, seasoned over time, and worked down to be about the thickness we need. Now it needs guides, or in this case, fletching, as they're commonly referred to, which will be utilizing feathers. In this case, a very common one, turkey feathers. Common method for this, traditionally, is to take feathers from either the wing of the bird or the tail of the bird that are right next to each other. What that creates, if I go to the back of the feather, and I use this little guide or vein, I can split this feather down the middle and then utilize the top left or bottom right, but essentially matching pairs from feathers that are fairly matched to each other, and so they're like little copies of each other. Once attached to the arrow, will cause it to spin, much like rifling in a modern firearm, for accuracy. So now I can go ahead and take these feather fletchings, which are cut from the same side of the turkey feather to be pretty close to the same length. What I'm actually going to do is, just using my fingers, remove the initial few barbs or the sort of feather material from the front or the lower portion of the fletching, which will give me a space to actually lash onto the arrow, holding the feather tight. I'll do that with all three of them. I prefer to do them at the same time, that way I can sort of keep some uniformity or consistency in it. Just peeling off the first few there. The same thing is good to do from the back of the fletching, but because they don't pull as well in that direction, you could pull this way and pull all of the barbs with feather material right off. I go ahead and save that step for a little later once we've actually attached them to the arrow. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is utilizing a flat tool, usually against some sort of surface, something a little tougher, I can go ahead and actually take these little exposed feather ends here and flatten them out as much as possible That way, when they lash down to the arrow to hold the feather in place, they create as little profile or drag as possible. That way it glides smoothly over the bow and over your hand, smoothly through the air, and hopefully smoothly into your target. So now that we have our feather fletchings, we can go ahead and move the other pieces away, focus only on those. We're going to need some sort of serving, as it's commonly referred to, or thread. And a very popular, almost dominant choice in the eastern woodlands is going to be this. This is animal sinew, specifically from the back of a deer or other animal, so you get it in a nice long sheet like this. And it's a connective tissue that is incredibly strong. It will be used for sewing thread and fishing line and all different kinds of things. But it's very tough as it dries. So what we're going to do now is take this little piece of backstrap sinew, or sinew coming from the back of the deer. I'm going to part it out just a little bit. We don't need a huge amount of it, especially for the one arrow we're working on right now. Part it out into some small thin strips, and then we're going to soak it very briefly to go ahead and prep it for attaching the feathers to the arrow. Now we're going to go ahead and take this and put this in a little pot of water by the fire there to soften it for a few minutes. We've got our arrow pretty well straightened, ready, and notched, and we've got our fletchings, in this case turkey tail feather pieces, cut pretty well matched to each other. What we're going to do now is, utilizing some animal tendon, in this case deer backstrap sinew, we're going to go ahead and lash these feather pieces to the arrow, form a nice tight bond, and once they're settled, we'll glue them, make sure that they're good before they go ahead and dry, and it should create a nice tight spiraling effect for the arrow, which will increase accuracy. So, go ahead and take our animal, in this case deer sinew, which is a pretty common one, that we've soaked in water, make it nice and soft and pliable. Go ahead and part it out some. It is a very strong thread, has a very high tensile strength, so you don't really need a great amount of it. And using less of it also creates a thinner profile against the arrow, which creates less drag, helps it glide off of the bow, and in this style of archery, off of the hand it's actually resting on as well. I've parted out a fairly long piece of sinew. If you don't have full-length sinew, a small plant fiber cord or even short sinews could be twined into each other to create a similar effect. Go ahead, ensure my fletchings, which are prepped. I'm going to seat it. The method I prefer to do, I give myself about a good thumb's length down from the notch, so that when I am shooting this arrow, I'm not interfering too much with the feather, and the nock isn't right on top of it. It's a fairly common sort of setup in many places in the world. Pin the first fletching down, and I prefer to do them pretty well perpendicular to the nock with the first fletching, with them equidistant from each other or sharing the same amount of space on the arrow shaft. That usually tends to make this one face the shooter and the other two only glide by the bow as it shoots, instead of having to rub against it directly, which can cause them to wear faster. Place the second one a fair ways down the shaft, pull the tendon tight over it, keeping an eye to place them at the same distance as much as possible, and also the same relation to each other north and south on the arrow shaft, so that they are as close to copies of each other as you can make them, even in the orientation or placement of the feather, as well as the size, angle, and bend as well. Because the feathers on birds are not perfectly straight, except for arguably maybe one of them down the middle of the tail, they all have a natural curve, which is why utilizing arrows, feathers right next to each other on the bird gives it that rifling or spin effect. The feather does not have to be twisted onto the shaft. It already comes with a twist of its own. I can go ahead and just feed this sinew down past the feathers onto the shaft. And really this is just sort of protecting the feathers from peeling up, creating sort of a buffer space. So I can pull the sinew down on itself reasonably well when it's wet, but to go ahead and lock it in place, what I can do after I eyeball this to make sure they're pretty straight is go ahead and dab some of what's here. This is hide glue, which is a collagen glue made from boiling down the membrane of the animal hides, commonly used today in carpentry and woodwind instruments as well. I'm going to take just a very small little stick here as the applicator, small being key, that way I can be very precise in where I put it. So I'm going to go ahead and layer it on right where the sinew meets the arrow shaft. This tiny bit that I'm putting on here is not really meant to sustain the arrow in use as much as it is to kind of just hold the sinew down right now. Once I have everything set right where I'd like it, then I'll come back and put a more liberal application of hide glue to go ahead and actually lock the feathers in place. For now, kind of hold there. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a smaller piece of sinew and I'm going to do a wrapping or a lashing right in the middle of the feather, which will pull it tight to the arrow shaft, and then follow it up with one up here that will then finish the job. Doing the best to split the barbs of the feathers apart at about the same spot, so that when I do this little wrap in the middle of the feather, it doesn't necessarily bend too many of the barbs down, which would kind of make a little more drag, especially where I don't want it. It's one of the spots in the arrow making that usually you refine over time and requires a little bit of practice, and sometimes requires being done 2 or 3 times to get it just perfect. This one I prefer to go ahead and put a little simple overhand knot in the sinew to lock it in place, since I can't necessarily wrap it down the shaft without blocking up some of the barbs and feathers. Now that we've got the fletchings or feathers attached initially down at the bottom and lashed in the center, what we're going to go ahead and do is my preferred method for actually trimming the feathers, because these are far too large. It would create a tremendous amount of drag, and also trimming it back here initially will give me a space to lash the feather down and finish the fletching process. This could be done in several ways. Reference using cane knives, sharp flint blades that you've seen me use already. My preferred method is to actually take several small pieces of wood, feed them into the fire, and use them as coals to actually singe the fletchings right into shape. Very easy, simple method utilizing fire. We have trimmed the fletchings down to shape using essentially that little knife of fire, a little coal on the end of the stick there. We've trimmed them down for a couple of reasons. One, it makes them more uniform. 2, it opened a space for me to actually lash down, finish the fletching of the arrow, and it creates way less drag when you trim them down. Commonly in movies and TV shows, you'll actually see the feather fletchings being very tall because it looks nice to a lot of people, but what that does essentially is acts like a parachute. It will cause the arrow to fly very slowly because there's a lot of drag behind it. So traditionally your arrows are going to be much, the fletchings will be trimmed down, sometimes even further than this. So all you're causing is that spinning effect, not creating a huge amount of drag, which would slow the arrow. But to go ahead and finish our fletching, we're going to take one last piece of deer sinew or tendon and wrap them up top here, eyeball it to make sure that they're pretty spot on with each other, and then apply a fair little coating of glue to lock it in place. The top fletching or lashings like this can be tied in a knot. They can be lashed and wrapped over. I prefer commonly to tie a knot because it's simple, conserves a little bit more of the material, and then any leftovers or tails of the knot can actually be just lashed over and tucked under the ends of the feathers, which will actually generate a little bit of pressure to hold it in place a little tighter. This is when finished, a tool or projectile that will be moving at high speed, hitting things and stopping very rapidly. So making sure that it's well made is far more important than making sure that it's made quickly. Alright, so I've got the knot tied and the tails tucked or hanging loose, at least the continuing tail tucked there. So I can go ahead and trim these off, either using a little bit of fire again, or in this case I'll just use a little flint blade and get rid of the excess. See, it doesn't take much pressure with his edges being very sharp, even through this sort of tough cord like sinew. Go. So now, sort of see, arrow not perfectly straight, but the fletching's pretty spot on in that they have about the same distance between each other, and they are almost little copies of each other as well, the feather pieces, which would cause a nice tight rifling effect. While the sinew is still fairly wet, it's very easy to edit this. I can simply push the feathers around on the arrow just to line them up exactly how I want them. But since this one seems pretty well set, what I'm going to go ahead and do now is wrap a little bit of sinew just ahead of the nock, so that when I'm shooting the arrow, the pressure of the string doesn't cause the wood to split. I'll put a little reinforcement right there, and then we can go ahead and line this with whatever glue of choice the arrow builder or fletcher is using, and let it dry for a little while, have it ready to shoot. Some of your Powhatan and Eastern Woodlands bows will be generating a fair bit of force. Draw weights could be as low as 40 or 50 pounds. It could be as high as 90 or 100. So that really translates to a fair bit of force being imparted from the bow and the string. Without reinforcement, some of your arrow shafts from time to time can split in the back just from being used or fired. So this little reinforcement should prevent that, and usually it does. If it doesn't full-on prevent the splitting of the arrow shaft over time, what it will do is prevent it from running down into the fletching and causing the arrow to be worthless at that point. But with all of that set, we'll go ahead and apply some hide glue here, which is made, as I referenced before, from the boiling of the inner membrane or the leftover portions of the animal hide. So I prefer to go ahead and take a really small applicator and apply the glue right down the length of the fletching, just as kind of reinforcement. Keep it tight to the shaft, and also the fewer gaps you have between the feather and the shaft, the less drag, less wear, and sometimes the less noise the arrow will create as it flies through the air. Alright, that's about the sort of minimum we need to go ahead and keep the fletchings in place. And after we shoot the arrow to test that it works well, it can certainly be reapplied, more can be applied. And from time to time over the life of the arrow, you may simply replace or repair certain parts, like the glue or the lashings. We have a fletched, straightened and prepped arrow. What I'm going to go ahead and do now is just sort of sharpen and burnish this tip here, which really just give it the profile of, let's say, a wooden pencil. That's commonly going to be used for target practice and then also for small game, squirrels and rabbits and birds. It's to be very effective against that type of game. So with sort of scraping with a flint blade, polishing it against the stone, and then lightly placing it into the fire to sort of harden it up a little bit, it'll give you a fairly sharp and durable point that should hold up against small game, and you will occasionally hit trees and soil and things like that. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed joining us today for our video about building arrows. If you did, certainly like, subscribe, and leave a comment below.